Hey there, neighbors. Lee at Neighborhood Comics, Savannah, Georgia here. It's so nice to see you. Sorry we're getting started a little bit late tonight. It was inevitable that our technical limitations were going to catch up with us at some point. But we're here. We did it. We're all in this together. Thanks so much for joining us. A lot of big stuff happening at the shop right now. Big week. So if you follow us on social media or if you've been in the store lately, you know, we are welcoming a new employee on. Olivia, thanks so much for joining us. It's been a blast so far. We're looking forward to getting to know you and looking for our customers to getting to know you better. Also today, we launched our publishing imprint. So that's pretty nutty. So we announced our book that's coming out in March written by Craig Finn of The Hold Steady and illustrated by Andrew Greenstone, who is a SCAD grad, which is really cool. A neat little bit of kismet that came together as we worked on that. Today, we are continuing our Creator Convo series with Zach Thompson. Now, Zach, we have a lot of readers at our shop who like to pick up the creepy books, and I feel like Zach has a real knack for that. So he's found a home with a lot of our shop regulars, and I'm just going to cut to it. I'm going to get Zach right up in here. He's joining us. 3, 2, 1. There he is. What's up, Zach? How you doing, man?
Hello. Good, man. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for making time tonight. I know that you're a busy dude, and it's COVID times, and you're not local anyway, so it's not like you could just pop on over and say hi. So this is great for us. Thanks so much, man.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So I want to get into your new books. You got a couple of books that are on the shelf now from Aftershock that have done really well at the shop, which I'm always excited about. And I appreciate the enthusiasm and the participation from creators like you who are willing to get out in front of what they're doing and talk to people about it. But before we get into Lonely Receiver and I Breathed a Body, I'm really curious about your origin story in terms of comics, how they entered your life. So do you remember the first time that you were exposed to comics, that you realized that this was a thing?
Yeah, I grew up in the 90s, and so my older brother sort of collected a bunch of comics whenever like Age of Apocalypse was coming out. So like I found random Age of Apocalypse back issues and sort of read through those with no idea what was going on other than like Wolverine didn't have a hand and looked really cool, and like for some reasons like Colossus had like a bandana that his eyes went through, weird stuff like that. But I love the designs, and that really spoke to me. But like the funny thing is like the thing that first sort of like grabbed me was my mom's Archie digests, and I read through like stacks and stacks of them and to beg my mom at the grocery store to get me a new one every time we went to get groceries.
So those were her vintage. Those were the ones from the 70s or whatever she was coming up that she picked up, the digest, the really fat ones that are like, 120 pages or whatever.
Yeah. And I would just like mow through those. Like the X-Men and stuff interested me, but like that was the stuff that held my attention, which is so funny.
Well, it's not. I mean, I think that there's just it's a different type of storytelling. I mean, it's all storytelling. That's all this stuff is. But the Archies, there's something about that. And I feel like some of the best comic people are people who came to comics through Archie. Like there's something just really, really wonderful about that. And, we have I'm really clear to call it an all ages section here and not a kids section, because the number of grandparents or great grandparents who come in and are like, oh my God, they still make Archie. There's like a real thing of nostalgia and sweetness. Those are always the best people. So, and it's really, honestly, maybe you're a little bit after that generation, but for a lot of people, those supermarket Archies or the drugstore Archie digests were like really, really formative for what this stuff is.
Yeah, and it also just kind of showed me that like there didn't really need to be conflict per se, in that it wasn't like people it wasn't about people punching each other hardest,
Yeah.
And that was really cool to me. And it has like I think seeped into my work in a big way.
Well, that's like a really interesting dichotomy too, because that Age of Apocalypse era X-Men, I'm not super sure how it holds up from a couple of different perspectives. I think there's some real nostalgia for a lot of it, you know what I mean? But when I pull out those issues, or the omnibus is about to come out, and it's like a $125 book, and I'm looking at stocking it, and I'm like, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, I reread all of it in prep for Age of X-Man like 2 years ago.
Wow.
And it was, I mean, like, I'm glad I did, because it's such a formative event, but it was also just like, it was hard. There's a lot of spaces in it where I was like, it could have been tighter here, guys.
Well, there's something about drawing these events out too. I mean, even now we see it in so many series. There's something about like hitting these milestones with the number of books we need to move across a line, or get people interested in other titles. I get it, it's business. But you're getting, so you had some comics, you had an older brother kind of get you in, you had a parent who supported it, would pick up stuff for you. How old were you when you kind of put the pieces together of, oh, well, these are people who do this for their job. It's not something that just magically appears on the shelf. Oh, somebody gets to make comics in whatever role that is.
Yeah, so like I kind of see like 2 points really, like Y the Last Man being the first thing that I read that I picked up monthly, and then that kind of made me like a Wednesday warrior, where I was like in every week at my shop, making sure I had a pull list and sort of following different books. But then, like, as time goes on, that was, 10 years of collecting books. And I was like, sort of looking at it going like, maybe I can do this. Like, maybe this is something that is actually accessible to me. And it was kind of around the New 52 era. So about a decade ago at this point, where I started to get really into Jeff Lemire, actually. And realizing Jeff Lemire was Canadian was sort of this light bulb moment for me, where I was like, oh, maybe Canadians can do this. Maybe we can make comics. And it's a weird thing to be like Canadian being a barrier, but it just sort of felt like it was inaccessible, or people didn't really talk about it as much. As I was from a very small town, and the comic book community was really tight. And I came out to the West Coast, and it was sort of a different sort of thing. And then slowly I found a group of people who are as passionate about it as me. And then we ended up making some books together.
So when you were first starting it, did you get into Y at the beginning, or did you come in somewhere after, like, it had been ongoing a little bit?
It wasn't right at the beginning. I'd say like I was on board probably by like issue 5 or 6.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were able to catch up
through to the end.
Oh, that's amazing. What else were you picking up around that time? Do you remember? Was there anything else that you had on a pull that maybe didn't make as big of an impact, but what else were you going for?
Spawn was crazy. Just in terms of like, I just love the idea that it was like a superhero comic that was like really gritty and insane, and sort of showed me all these crazy like creatures. And I was like a member of the McFarlane Toys like fan club, where I was like mailing in to get the original figures and stuff like that. So like I had a real I think I like just generally like the creator own type stuff, so like I never really had a kick where I was reading Avengers and that kind of thing, just because it didn't really interest me, and like as things progressed, like it was actually, like I said, almost the New 52 that sort of brought me back into superheroes, because it felt like for the first time since I was reading that it was accessible in this weird way. And now I look back at that and I'm like, I had to do like some archaeological digging where I'm like, oh, why did I like that? Oh, there's actually some like reading Animal Man and then going back and learning Morrison's Animal Man, and then like, that just starts snowballing to a point where then you're like, well, now it's just my life.
We talked to Justin Osterling a couple of days ago, and Justin did a lot of coloring work on some of the New 52 books. And so that was kind of his break-in, and it was really fun that that's come up 2 convos in a row now. Because for me, just as we didn't have the shop when the New 52 came out, I was just a regular reader. And yeah, there's something really empowering. It's become a bit of a gimmick with the bigger, publishers, but that idea that everything is starting, you can get in fresh. Yeah, it's probably a good idea to know who Batman is. I get it. But
Yeah,
we're going to do
yeah.
52 titles wide, which means Vixen gets a book. And, you know, like
Yeah.
that was really pretty cool. I wish that I liked those books more, but the
Yeah,
idea was
same.
great. There was a way more representation than there had been in the past. And when you have a line that wide, you get some cool stuff. But Lemire is a great touchstone. I feel like he is able to, like, if I could pick somebody to have their career or whatever, like Jeff does like some really cool stuff because, as you know,
Yeah.
he works for the big guys. He does his own stuff. He's like the busiest man in show business, Jeff Lemire.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And your comment about a Canadian is funny because I'm a big comedy fan, and you know I watch all these documentaries, and you know when you hear about these people like that do break out of Canada, there's this weird kind of I don't know, that like what you said, that idea of we can't do that. That's something other people do that is just so uniquely Canadian from everything that I know about these things. And so that's really interesting that stretches over to doing this too.
Yeah, there's very little encouragement in terms of like arts and stuff in Canada. It's getting a
Interesting.
little bit better now, but like whenever I was younger, like I mentioned, like I grew in, like the smallest province in Canada. Like the idea of being an artist or being a writer was just something that like people were like, no, you're a fisherman or a farmer, and that's about it. Like, don't have any dreams, kid. And so like I left, and then I sort of started meeting people who really pursued art, and that was sort of when I was like, oh, I don't have to be a writer in secret anymore. I can kind of like pursue this in earnest.
So when that switch flipped, you know, you'd been picking up some of these creator-owned titles. You were seeing that, you know, comics existed beyond Cape books or kid books, and that you could tell these more mature stories. What was your path to actually doing it as a professional? Did you start on spec, or did you like meet up with people? Like, what was your path?
So I co-write a lot of my books with Lonnie Nadler, who just this past year did like Black Stars Above at Vault.
Yep.
And most of my books up until basically this year have been co-written with Lonnie. Um, Lonnie and I met in film school out in Vancouver, and we started talking about. I had a screenplay called The Dregs, which ended up becoming our first book, and it was this thing that I kept being told at film school was extremely unmarketable because it stood with a homeless guy being taken off the street and ground into sausage and then served at a fancy restaurant. And I had just moved to the big city, and I had seen like homelessness en masse for the first time, and like my like small town brain was just like shell shocked by that. And I was just fixated on it. And all through film school, that was the screenplay that I worked on, and it kind of just never ended up going anywhere. So about a year or two later, Lonnie and I were talking on the way back from Emerald City Comic Con, and I was like, I have the screenplay, like maybe we could work it into something. So we kind of just took it and stripped down the premise, and then figured out how do we translate this into the language of comics. We met up with Eric Zawadzki, who was a local comic book artist, had some beers with him, and we're like, hey, we have this crazy proposition for you. Do you want to try and make this? And he had grown up in Vancouver, and had seen this like homelessness like firsthand his whole life. And so he thought it was a really interesting thing to explore. At that time, I was also doing journalism. So I was working for Vice in the downtown East Side, which the graphic novel is about that community and sort of like trying to get to know these people and learn the stories behind them. And so I was trying to do something that blended journalism, film school, and sort of a sharper edge to like the narrative in terms of the metaphors that are being used, like actually consuming homeless people, because that's what really felt like was happening in the city at the time. And we pitched it to literally everyone, and like, you know, publishers that I currently work with said absolutely not. But Black Mask took a chance on it back in 2016, and like we worked on it for a year in secret before anyone knew about it, and it kind of came out, and people found it, and it got a really devoted audience, and that sort of like it was crazy. I went from like just doing it like in my spare time to being my full-time job in like 18 months, which is
Wow.
wild.
Well, I love that it was bootstrapped. I love that it was like an original concept that you labored over with a group of trusted friends and then
Yeah.
pitched it as like a completed thought. Like this is it. This is what we want to do. And it's so funny now because, when I'm talking to customers about books on the racks, inevitably 95% of the books are just like, oh, and this is coming out on Amazon Prime or Netflix. And so the idea of taking a screenplay and working it back to comics as opposed to the other way around almost seems novel in 2021.
Yeah. And like it's also just like not as easy as we had anticipated. Like there's a lot. I'm currently doing that with another project that I can't really talk about, but the poetics of both forms are very different in the way that they work. And sometimes like just simple things like, oh, the mechanics of the narration, like you don't really have voiceover narration in most traditional films anymore. But like if you're going to do a comic about a guy who thinks he's a detective, you got to find a way to work in narration in this cool, interesting, reflexive way. So the story starts to evolve in this other direction, and you come up with these visual metaphors or whatever. And like, I talk to Lonnie about this all the time because it's interesting. Sometimes you just get things that are handed to you and they're like, hey, like this was a failed TV series pitch. Do you want to like write it as a comic? And I'm always like, no, I don't want to do that work. Because that's a really hard job. It's not easy if you want to do it right, I should say. I mean, plenty of people do it to diminishing returns.
Well, yeah, no, that's really interesting because from the outside looking in, I'm like, it's a script. But no, you're absolutely right. When you're thinking about how, as a comic book writer, you have the ability to convey all this information in different ways that is technically off screen, whether it's an internal monologue or it's a setting or whatever else, it's not necessarily in camera, whereas it has to be for actual actors or animation or to be portrayed on the screen in that way. And that's really, really interesting. I think I haven't been giving people enough credit, so thanks for that. So Black Mask, a very cool publisher. They do a lot of really interesting stuff, so that's fun that they took a chance on that book. And like you said, it was a period of like 18 months when you went from, working your regular gigs to being a comic scribe. Did you find for you, it was a case of once you had that first published work that people would come to you or they would just listen to your pitches a little bit closer? What was the difference?
There's a combination of things. Like for one, it came out and there was one issue out, and then the second issue came out the week of like Emerald City Comic Con, and we were in Emerald City Comic Con, and Fanboy made it like their pick of the week of our second issue, and like that I didn't even know what that meant at the time, and the publisher was like, that's good, that's a very good thing for you guys. And then we found that publishers started to come to us and ask us to pitch, and that's actually kind of where I met Aftershock in 2017. And they read the first two issues of The Dregs, and they were like, guys, this is great. Like, come work with us. And it was as simple as that, really. They sort of opened their door, and over the course of like 6 months, we talked to them, and then they offered Lonnie and I a 3-book deal based off of just reading 2 issues of The Dregs. And then once the third issue came out, Axel Alonso, the then editor-in-chief of Marvel, read it and tweeted about it. And then like 3 months later, we were working at Marvel. And like a lot of luck involved in that. It was just like right place, right time. It just happened to, I think there was a larger conversation happening at that time around the overdose crisis, and the book really tackled that with teeth. And I think that it really resonated with people, and we just kind of caught this like cultural moment. And then my career got kind of kicked in the ass, and I've just been riding that wave ever since.
I love that. No. the more like, so your story is a little bit unique as opposed to the last couple of creators I've talked to, where theirs have been kind of, there's some right, with all of these stories, there's some right place, right time. But with them, it was kind of oh, I met somebody who worked in the industry. They let me do some fill-in work, or they introduced me to this person. But from you coming really from an outsider's perspective of not having someone hand you something or to, to bring you into the fold, to pitch your way in and then be accepted as someone who's a fan of the genre. You were a monthly subscriber to books. What did that, do you still remember kind of what that felt like to be like, oh, they like me, they really like me?
Yeah, in this really weird way, so like I mentioned, I was doing journalism at the time, and one of the things I found really, really tough about journalism was like, I really wanted to talk about some really tough stuff, homelessness in particular in Vancouver, and it kind of always ran into these walls. And then what I found was interesting was like when I started masking some of these really heady concepts in fiction, it sort of resonated with people in a deeper way and made them start these dialogues. And so I got to do all the things that I wanted to do in journalism, but through fiction. And I was like, I felt like I was getting away with murder, to be perfectly honest. Like, it was just like, holy shit, like, you guys are gonna let me do this? Like, this seems insane to me. And it was just this like, I feel really lucky because up until that point, I was kind of struggling with what my voice was going to be as a writer, where my community was, what that space looked like for me. Like, was I going to write screenplays? Was I going to write novels? What was I going to do? I knew I didn't want to be a journalist, but that was what was paying the bills at the time. And so when I kind of started to go to Comic Cons, because as I mentioned, like where I grew up, comic culture was small and there was no cons and there was no guests or anything like that. So as soon as I came out to the West Coast, and I started going to Emerald City and I started meeting people who were passionate, I was like, holy shit, like this is where I belong. This is the sort of stuff I want to do. And these people want to talk to me about this kind of stuff. So it was like almost figuring out how to like get into this cool club that no one else considers cool, and sort of just being able to like have the opportunity to get excited about these things with people who are also excited about them. And like, it's completely changed my life in all these fantastic ways.
I am really curious, before we start digging into the recent books, about about your formative comic book shop experience. So you said this, smaller, it wasn't as big of a scene. What was that shop that you kind of felt like was your first home shop? How did you find it? What was the vibe? Like how did it manifest in your life?
So they're still around, Comic Hunter in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island.
Awesome.
And, they were a really cool community space that was sort of like tons of long boxes and stuff that you could pick through, that was super cheap. But particularly like what drew me was Pokemon cards.
Yeah.
I grew up during the Pokemon boom. And so my younger brother and I went there and we would trade Pokemon cards. And then that space sort of became this cool place where we could like go and chat with people. And like, I still have this like formative experience of going and buying like a booster pack, getting a Charizard, being able to open it, sell it back to the shop for like 45 bucks. And then I bought myself Spawn action figures with it. And that was like, to me, that was like where my comic book business acumen began.
A speculator from day one, Zach. I don't know quite how I feel about that, but like if the shop was cool with it, that's all that matters.
And like then I started playing Magic and went to like Magic leagues at the shop and stuff, and like it just became this space that like, in a small town, there's not a whole lot to do. Places close early. If you're not drinking age, what do you do? And for me, it was hang out at the comic book store. This was before online gaming and all that stuff. So it was like it was, formative in so many ways, but also like allowed me to have a really close relationship with my younger brother. And that was something that we started to share in a big, big way.
I love that. That's what it's about. That's why we do this stuff. Ultimately, as much as I would love to tell you it's a get rich quick scheme, it's totally not, Zach. It's something that we do because we honestly care about this stuff, and it's so cool to meet other people who care about it. And one of the nice things about being in Savannah, Georgia, is we have the Savannah College of Art and Design here. So it's a big art school program that has a sequential art program that, actually like gets people jobs in the industry later on. And one of your recent collaborators is a SCAD alum, and that's Jen Hickman. And
I
so
had no idea.
you don't
That's
read the
awesome.
back. You don't read the back of your books where you can read Jen's bio. It's literally right here. I don't know if they're
Amazing.
contractually obligated to mention SCAD and everything they do, but it's
I had no
here.
idea. That's awesome.
And Jen has several I guess people who are students at the same time or professors that follow her work, and come in and make sure to pick up stuff that has her name on it. And so Jen was part of the reason that we invested a little heavier, perhaps than normal, in Lonely Receiver. We had just been noticing we're a pretty new shop. We're coming up on our second anniversary. And as a part of that, we try to be really flexible. I say all the time that I'm not the tastemaker, the customers are. Like, what people are asking about is what we carry. And so some of the Aftershock books, some of the edgier books, some of the books that are, I don't want to say necessarily just horror, because that's such a broad, especially now with triggering and everything, like that can be a very broad thing.
Yeah.
But just, I like to say creepy. I like to say creepier books. and so with some of those, we started to invest more in. And I thought that this book, because Jen was on it, made a lot of sense. I knew your name for some of your other books. Like you said, your Marvel work in particular, I was totally aware of. But this is A Lonely Receiver has really been a breakout book in our shop. And I'm really interested. You talked about your background in journalism, and I see so much of that in both this book and your latest for Aftershock, I Breathed a Body, which came out just this past week. Because there's a reportage type style, but there's also like a futurist bent with both of these books, where I feel like you are looking at what's happening in the world and projecting 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And if you've read any of these, that may seem like it's way too close, but I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure the way things are going. And so I feel like I'm not going to do any spoilers, number one. I want people to pick up these books. You can get on board with all of Lonely Receiver up to date at this point in the shop. I Breathed a Body just started. We will be stocking it all the way through, so you can catch up whenever you get in. So I don't want to spoil anything for anybody. But I feel like, and I bet you have a special kind of connection to this as a creative, but as a people, our relationship to technology, whether that is our devices, whether that is what social media brings us, do you have what you would consider a healthy relationship with those things?
I do now.
Good.
I
Okay.
didn't before. And a lot of that came from just some of the research that I did going into these books, sort of changed my perspective on a lot of things. And I said, like, with the sort of my career being kicked in the butt and moving so quickly, I also saw sort of like my relationship to social media had to change really, really, really fast. And it changed the way that people interacted with me, and like that moment where you are a writer and you're working on indie books and no one gives a shit, and then like all of a sudden you start working at Marvel. I got people from film school started reaching out, and like the tone changed on a lot of things, and people started taking you more seriously, and that feels really weird and inauthentic. And so I had to have a lot of moments where I sort of took a step back and went like, what is going on here? How do I define my relationship with it? But how do I define myself on there? And how is that different than who I am in my personal life? And that's not something we often talk about, but it's something that a lot of creators have to go through, is like, where do you draw that line, and how much of your personal life do you share with people? And like, that's very much part of Lonely Receiver, is like, how much of your personal life do you give to your devices? How much do you overinvest, and do you at a certain point become codependent? What I say a lot of the times is like, Lonely Receiver is a book about how the devices we use end up using us.
Mm. Oh, that's really interesting to hear it kind of phrased that way. I shared both of these books today with Olivia, who's our newest employee, and I was really happy. She knew we were going to be talking today, and I wanted to get a fresh take on these two books. She is a senior sequential major at SCAD, and so I was just really, really curious. I'm sure that she has her own inputs, like we all do. Where you come from, what your previous influences are. She said that she was not going to be put off by anything creepy. So I was like, cool. All right, this is not like a weird boss relationship. Read this. And the physicality of Lonely Receiver, or what kind of is perceived as physicality with our device, that is something that I feel. Siri just said she didn't understand. I guess she heard part of that. Like, I don't either, Siri. But there's something about that is so incredibly intriguing to me. And at the end of the first issue, for me, that idea of what a physical relationship with a device, even in a far future, was just kind of like, wait, now what happened? And it's in 2 and 3, it all comes together and you get it. But when I describe it to people, when I tell people about Lonely Receiver, I use as a reference point the Joaquin Phoenix movie Her, where he kind of like the voice assistant on his phone as a gateway into that. Again, I try not to give away too much, but do you like? I would consider you a futurist. I consider most comic book writers futurists, honestly, because you're thinking about sci-fi, you're thinking about tech, you're thinking about all these kinds of things. How far-fetched? Like, how far are you throwing that ball for Lonely Receiver?
I honestly don't feel like it's too far off from where things are going. And like, funny you mentioned Her, because I did pitch the book as like, it's her as a horror story, essentially. And sort of like where that story ends, this one begins at that point and kind of goes from there. And I was really intrigued, and what I presented to Aftershock was essentially like, I want to do a horror story about sort of like an existential breakup with technology and allowing us to sort of like look at our relationship with our phones in particular in this like really visceral, sort of like horrifying, introspective indictment of ourselves, essentially. And using the brain as a framing device is to sort of make it relatable, show it's something that we all have gone through. And, like you can take all of the sci-fi out of the book and translate it into sort of what like a normal breakup is.
Yes.
And it still works. And that was really important to me, was like taking out all of that stuff. It still logically makes sense. Well, other than maybe some stuff at the end.
Well, what I loved that Olivia, just coming to this first issue, walking away from, she was really talking about the emotional impact of the main character. Like, it was really about her psyche, about her dealing with a breakup. She, knew like there was a tech aspect, but that the fact about the phone or the device didn't quite click, at the end of the first issue. And so once I kind of broke that, face melt, but like there was, I love that is a very personal story. It's told like in a very insular way about someone who is isolated and is depressed and is angry and frustrated, and all the real reactions that any of us would have if we were going through a traumatic breakup or a global pandemic or just chemical imbalance, any of those things we can do. And so that's what, and Lonely Receiver for me has been, I just personally, I don't really gravitate toward what I call horror books. But this is so psychological. Like, it really is about people in a really real way, that I found it to be such an easy put in somebody's hand, tell them, look, give this a chance. Don't like it, bring it back. Nobody's brought it back, Zach. So it is, it's been really, really great. And what has your relationship with Jen been like? How are when you send a script, I've been talking to artists a lot lately, and so I've been talking to their side of what happens when they get a script. But
Yeah.
for you, how much do you give to, especially maybe a new collaborator or someone who hasn't worked with you before? How much do you give them in the script that you provide?
I've been pretty intense, like Alan Morian collaborator, in that like I dictate like shot sizes and layouts and but I'm not dictate's the wrong word. I don't dictate it in that I just put as much detail as I possibly can and try and think about things visually, because a background in film school, but also just like used to draw and really think about how these things can be arranged on the page, with the caveat being that like here is my best version of this. Change everything if it's not working for you, but here's what I'm looking at. Lots of visual reference, lots of hyperlinks, that kind of thing. And specifically with Jen, we have gotten along incredibly well, which I think you can actually kind of tell within the book, in that like the first issue was written before Jen came onto the project. Then everything from then on actually kind of got reworked because I had seen how they had tackled everything in the first issue, and we started talking a lot just about how to collaborate on this. I kept running things by them, being like, does this make sense? Would this work? How do we want to do this visually? This, that, and the other thing. So there's like a sequence in issue 2, for example, where the main character is sort of answering 100 questions about the phone. And that visual sequence, I was like, well, I want it to look like it's underwater. And then like Jen came back with that beautiful color splash over it that sort of like oversaturates everything and has those like weird lights in the wall. And that was sort of just from talking about that and getting to that point, like through text messages and that kind of thing. And then like that kind of snowballed into every subsequent issue, sort of always collaborating and always talking and sort of running things by one another. And toward the end as well, just in terms of the resolution of the story, they were involved as well, because it was important to me that they felt like it resonated with them emotionally as much as it did for me, because I didn't want this to be a thing where, you know, when you're so far in the weeds with someone after 5 6 months, like you don't want them to like secretly not like the ending or whatever. And it's so important to me that people feel like they're a valuable part of the team and that they can collaborate on it. Because like I never got into this to say like it's my way or the highway, and like I don't know best, you know, like all I know is sort of what my goal is, and I'm hoping that we have a safe enough relationship that we can kind of just talk about that and how to hit that the best way possible.
Oh my God, I love that. Yeah, Jen's work in this book is really, really complimentary to the writing, the mood, the tone, the tonality of the, like the actual color tonality of the whole thing is really, really solid, because it is so closed. I mean, it's dark without just everything being washed in black. It's washed in blues and greens and reds and pinks and purples, but it still feels so insular and warm in a way that you need to kind of get into that. So that's great. I'm glad they've been a good collaborator with you on that book, and you've had that kind of relationship. Got a quick little comment here from Derek, who's tuning in right now. Derek's still going through his Lonely Receiver. He's enjoyed the first 3 issues and the first of I Breathed a Body. And he's really enjoyed how you've taken so many modern concepts and found ways to pack punch with the metaphors in that. And we talked about it a little bit. The year's kind of about technology, about social media, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a second. But
Yeah.
you know, through the lens of a journalistic background, do you feel like you're kind of still reporting in a way when you write this in a weird way?
I try to trick people into learning stuff, I think is how I phrase it, is that like, and it also comes from like a trying to anticipate the needs of a collaborator as well. So like one of the things that Jen said to me early on in the process of Lonely Receiver was like, I was so thankful that you had these ideas for like these flesh phones, and that the world was like vibrant and colorful and had this like sort of stepped out of reality just slightly. And to me, I think about it like this, like with Lonely Receiver, and I Breathe the Body, both of those things are about social media, they're about phones, that kind of thing. But it's really boring to look at someone on their iPhone. Like it just because we're so used to that imagery. And so horror is all about sort of inspiring that little essence of dread. And so how do you like use those metaphors in a way that, like, for example, the phone is a living device and you see like the skin sort of lose color as the partner sort of disappears, that tells you something about that living thing and informs an aspect of the world. And then in the second issue, when you learn sort of more about what the phones are, it recontextualizes what you've seen before. And I really like doing that kind of thing because I feel like what happens with a lot of this stuff is like, I didn't want to write I Breathe the Body about a YouTuber and like Facebook, because who wants to who wants to pay $5 and then like look at someone on their Facebook page? What's far more interesting is creating like phones that kind of look like bugs and fly around, and you're like, how in the hell is that a thing? But it also allows you to create this extra layer of metaphorical context that you start to unpack. So like the mushrooms are a huge part of I Breathe the Body that talks about interconnectivity and what that means. And that's sort of something that like will continue to build much in the same way as Lonely Receiver. And so the whole idea, I guess, behind it is like use these complex metaphors that are visual primarily. And as the story progresses, you can go back through it a second time. And with that newfound context of what you learned in subsequent issues, it kind of redefines the way that you interpret the story, which is something I very specifically steal from David Cronenberg.
Well, that's great. Steal from the best. That's how it goes. No, that's wonderful. And I definitely got that vibe with Lonely Receiver. Like I did feel like each issue really built on it, not just in a way that a lore or world building traditionally does in any kind of sequential media, but really just kind of made those small things bigger every time. And you went back and you remembered what happened. I'm like, oh, that is this thing, or that can mean more than perhaps I took it at face value. So the new book is I Breathe the Body, also coming to us from Aftershock. So hopefully they're treating you right. That's all I can say. And so with I Breathe the Body, you're working with Andy McDonald on the art here. And this book for me, so I get the press release, as a shop owner, I do. And, I was able to follow you on social media, of course. And so the term fungal horror was perhaps one I did not have in my lexicon before this book. And you mentioned the mushrooms, so let's just go ahead and jump into this book. It's technical, it's digital, but it's also organic. Like you're really meshing these two different things in a really interesting way. We've got one issue. I'm not going to spoil anything about this issue, but like Lonely Receiver, I am guessing there's lots more to this. Definitely how I Breathe the Body ends is a real kind of, oh, what is happening with the rest of this? So I don't want to confuse people and make them think it's the same kind of book, because stylistically, in terms of the art, of course, but also in terms of the storytelling so far, I Breathe the Body feels like a bigger story. It feels like more of a global story, whereas Lonely Receiver is much smaller. Does that resonate? Is that right?
Yeah. So like the way I explain it to people is like Lonely Receiver is a book about like a primary sort of everyday person who is a consumer of said technology buys that device. And then I Breathe the Body is very much about the people at the top who make the decisions, who manipulate the market, that kind of thing. And it's just sort of provide different versions of similar themes, but viewing them from completely different points. Because I thought that was important too. That was something that, as I was researching Lonely Receiver, I was like, oh, I kind of want to talk about all this, but that's like the corporate side of it. And so that sort of all got squirreled away and then kind of just naturally evolved into I Breathe the Body. And also like in the context of the year that we just had, in the terms of like what you keep seeing on social media and how, like throughout the summer, I just felt so, I don't know. My senses felt assaulted, right, by the level of trauma that we were seeing enacted on social media in real time. And so I was like, I need to say something about this. I need to make a book about this. Um, so yeah,
Well,
that's kind of where it was born.
yeah, no, from the outside and just how publishing schedules lined up, I love to think in my mind that they were related in some way. And so it's nice to hear that there was the thought process of one kind of bleeding into another. So we talked about Lonely Receiver. It's about a woman and her relationship with technology in a very broad way. But I Breathed a Body is like you said, from the top down. It's corporations, it's influencers, but there is still drama. There is like
Yeah.
people still aren't happy, even though when they have the things, they have the adoration, they have the money, but they're still incomplete people. Um, and you talk about research for a book like this. What were you looking into? Like, were you looking into like just YouTubers, or are you going through Zuckerberg's trash? I mean, what's the end for you?
So two ways. I mean, like one was in the latter end of my journalism career. I was a video producer for like a really large journalism website, and my job was to work with influencers to make like man on the ground type journalism. And so like a lot of that kind of just I was like filing that away mentally, being like, this is insane. I need to write about this. But like it took me 3 or 4 years to sort of process what that was like, because like I was at work the day that Jake Paul or Logan Paul, I get them confused, uploaded the Suicide Forest video, for example. And I
Yes,
sat in
I
a
thought of that while I was reading this. I felt like that was a
yes.
very visceral connection. That's interesting. Oh wow.
And I sat in a room with like 12 other people and watched everyone rationalize why it was okay that a child just put a dead body on the internet. And to
Yeah.
me, that was the seed of this book wholeheartedly. Was like it was just interesting because I felt like, even though I love horror or whatever, I felt personally like transgressed. Like I was like, oh, that's something I never wanted to see, and I had to see it. And now that I've seen it, I'm sitting in a room and all these people are just telling me it's okay and that's not a big deal. And that was really interesting to me, because at the end of the day, the discussion was like, well, there's money to be made, so we can't be too offended by this. And I was like, right, that's what drives all of this bullshit, is just there's money to be made. And the other thing is that like I'm not entirely certain, a couple of years later, like it was a speed bump in that guy's career, if that, you
Yeah.
know?
It
And
made
so
more
that's
people
really interesting.
sure. I mean, it elevated his profile for good or bad, and ultimately the expression is any press is good press, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, maybe you're a little bit more conscious. Probably didn't, but probably wasn't going to tune in anyway. but I do
Yeah.
know his name involves the word Paul. I don't know in which,
Yeah.
but yeah, I think you're totally right. And the influencer kind of character in this book adopts a lot of kind of more urban affectations, like with the way it's dressed and the grill kind of thing, with the
Yeah.
teeth,
Yeah.
everything, in a really conflicting, is it authentic, like we do, like we do of people of a certain age, when we look at that people of that next generation of, well, is this an act, is this appropriation, is this an honest like way to attach yourself to something you really care about, or is this just
Yeah.
something popular? You want to give people the benefit of the doubt. I'm not sure about this kid.
Yeah. I mean, the book is pretty, like, it opens with a sequence that's like not so much he's not authentic, very much so.
I think that's a
And
great
then,
way to describe the opening sequence.
yeah. And there's a dual purpose to that too, right? Where you see that, and then the other thing to keep in mind is like the next page just jumps into like a very inauthentic apology, which I thought was like the quintessential influencer moment, is like someone being like, I'm so sorry I hurt all these people, but it's also their fault for being hurt by my actions. And I was like, what better way to skewer influencer culture than to like tackle the apology video. Yeah.
Like that is just the most ridiculous apology. But yeah, even for like scripted ones, it's just like go ahead and have it in the bank for whenever you screw up. Just go ahead, have an official publicist write it for you, and just keep it in your back pocket.
Yeah, and like that's sort of like the book sort of logically goes into how do we build campaigns on inauthenticity, but also like without getting into spoilers, the event that happens at the end of the first issue sort of is the catalyst towards, well, that was just put online. So how do we top that? How do we use this kid or what's left of him?
And I think that's look, we expect something to happen to our characters. That's what happens in comic books, right? But the difference with this transformation that happens at the end of the book is that it is live streamed. So it's not a private transformation. It is something that the world ostensibly has access to, and that thousands or hundreds of thousands of people are watching in real time due to the stature of this person and what happens. It's heavy. Your books are heavy. It's really important that people know that, look, we have a great shop. We have a really wide, diverse clientele. We sell books from all over the place. But for anybody who doesn't know yet, comics go across all genres. You
Totally,
can really hone in and find something that means a lot to you, that is interesting to you, that is comments on society, it comments on all the best comics do that anyway. Even back, Cape Comics in the 60s, Stan Lee's soapbox in the back of the book.
Yeah.
Comics are about pushing the envelope. They're about opening your mind up a little bit. They're about being entertained. But with these two books in particular, I feel like you're doing all those things. You're also educating in a way, but you're putting your personal views out there too, and you're giving people ultimately something to think about once they put the book down. So I've got a quick, Derek popped up another quick little thing I want to mention. So I thought this was really interesting too. So in I Breathed a Body, he's asking whose idea it was to have the highlighter effect in the lettering of the book. And he also loved the pseudo-fictional article in the back of the book as well. So nice. As a scripter, as a writer, is that something that you came to this with, or was that a happy accident later on?
So Hassan, who lettered the book, he and I have worked on, this is book number 3 at this point. And it essentially was like, it's interesting seeing the online reaction to this, because like people have sort of, by the nature of the book, they're like, what's going on? And people have been like compiling all the highlighted words and trying to see if there's meaning. And the very simple answer is that it's just the words that were supposed to be bolded, and we just decided it was like a corporate atmosphere. So like to create that highlighted sort of like tie to corporate life. But with that being said, there is something going on with the function of that like symbol that you see on the second page. Yes. And you would, once you get to about issue 4, you will actually be able to figure out what that symbol stands for if you pay attention to those highlighted words. It will eventually be explained as well, but you can figure out early. You'll have the tools to do so. And that's just like, I guess we're big braining it sometimes.
No, dude, like I feel like that is so the nerd on nerd level of stuff. I'm all about in a fictional language with some decipherable key that some Redditor is going to figure out. And
yeah.
History of the book you're working on. No. I think that's great. And I think that's cool that you're going to find a way for people maybe to get a little bit of an in on it, but it came from like a more organic place. There's an organic quality to that. So the way the words are highlighted as opposed to bolded. And I think organic is a good word for this book.
And that's the whole idea of the book, is that contrast between the organic and the technological, and like the also just like the dichotomy. Like a lot of what the book eventually gets into is sort of like, what is social media doing to ourselves? How is it making us sort of ostensibly like separate and exist in 2 states at once, which is something that mushrooms are very good at. So there's a lot of things that will start to collapse in on one another, but that's sort of what we're getting into is like the duality of how we have to exist in the modern world, and using mushrooms as both a metaphor for that, but also a metaphor for the internet. The hope is that I teach people a little bit about social media and mushrooms at the same time as scare the shit out of them.
Love that. Fungal horror, everybody. I breathed a body. Really cool book, really interesting book. This and Lonely Receiver, if you want to jump on board with, available on our website, available in store. We can get you completely caught up with what's happening in Lonely Receiver, and definitely get you onboarded with I Breathed a Body, which just started, which is so super exciting. Zach, I truly appreciate you taking time out of your day to talk to us about you, about your books. The world is crazy, and sometimes it's really nice to sit down with somebody who makes cool stuff and talk about the cool stuff that they make.
Yeah, this was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Really our pleasure. If you ever make it down south, Savannah, Georgia, we'll have you. We'll throw a barbecue. We'll make it vegan style. Yeah. We'll have a great time. So,
awesome.
Zach, if people want to continue to follow you personally, Instagram and Twitter, remind me your handle.
Zach B.E. Thompson.
That's it.
You can find me on both platforms that way.
Which in my head is Beth, and I'm like, that's always wrong. That's not a full word. It's the B.E. Zach B.E. Thompson. Zach with a C, not a K, and Thompson with a P. There you go. You got it.
Yeah,
I'll make
you got it.
And all the stuff for it. I really do appreciate it. Have a great night, and I look forward to talking to you again, hopefully when your next book is coming out or your next big secret thing you can't talk about. Maybe we'll do that.
Yeah. Thank you so much, man.
Of course, Zach. Take care.
Yeah, you too.
All right, guys. That was really, truly my pleasure to talk with Zach Thompson. What a cool guy. I haven't had a personal interaction with him. You know, a lot of the other creators we've talked to have been in the shop before or local, or I had some sort of a background with. But that was really cool that he reached out and we were able to make today happen. So I would remind everybody, pick up Zach's books. These are his creator-owned books. These are both off of Aftershock, I Breathed a Body, Lonely Receiver. Really interesting, especially if you want your comic that is a little bit more like socially aware, that has some concepts and ideas that maybe have been bouncing around in your own head, or you just wanted to hear somebody else's take on. So thanks again to Zach. I really appreciate everyone watching, for paying attention today. It's a great day. Take care of yourselves. Take care of everybody that you love. We'll see you in the store soon. You can follow us online at NBRHD Comics on all the platforms, at neighborhoodcomics.com. Stay well, everybody.